Welcome to Working the Word, Part 7. 6 down, Annali.
This is 7?
We have reached halfway.
Halfway.
We're at the midway. Oh. Yeah, it's English words.
Greek characters.
Just something to remind us. And let's just look back over what we've done over the past 6 weeks. We started out by asking the question, what makes the Bible so unique? And we gave you the tip that day to look at the Bible and to ask yourself, what's the picture of God that we see in this passage?
And I think that's a point we keep coming back to a lot. It's one of the really key, start here.
You mean we'll come back to it again today?
Yes.
In the second week, we looked at the history of the Bible, its original languages, the copying and translating processes that have brought it to us. And we looked at the tool for understanding, to look at context and how it contributes to our understanding of the passage. In our third program, we looked at Jesus' use of the Bible, how he used it, how he interpreted it. And we noticed patterns beginning to develop, and we sent you off just to look for and to see patterns and words being repeated and repeated. Our fourth episode looked at the big word theology. We decided it was simply words about God, and it was how we derive our picture of God from the Bible. And the thing that we particularly focused on as a practical thing in that one was to explore the metaphors. A lot of the Bible isn't in plain language. It's using all sorts of metaphors.
Particularly when it's dealing with really big concepts and just trying to find a way to make them accessible and understandable.
And then we decided it was helpful to understand the purpose for which the Bible was written. What was the original intent of Moses or Isaiah or Paul when they put it down? And we went right through the Bible in around about 60 minutes. And our tip was, ask the question why. Why was it written? What was the purpose of the original author as a guide to understanding it? Last week, we looked at 4 different things that were necessary to interpret the Bible correctly, including context, intent, and a couple of others. And we left you with the concept of don't feel you need to rush through the Bible. Be prepared to sit with it, to let it just simmer away in your mind, to sleep on it, and things will become plain.
Especially if you keep coming back to it, that, it's not just I've read it, you read it and then you come back to it and read it again.
And underline it and come back and underline it some more.
And colour it in.
And even say, what are the questions? What's the picture of God? Today we want to look at just a small sector of language, but we'd like to begin by introducing you to a tool that I think we have found to be really, really helpful. A couple of weeks ago, we introduced you to a free online software called eSword, and some of you may have put that on, and that's a really helpful little tool.
Well, I used that this week.
I used eSword this week, but this one, it's called BibleHub. It's not one that you download onto your computer, it's one that you can use online, and it is available for tablets, phones, all that sort of thing. We will put a link to it on the Facebook page, but if you want to search for it, you simply search for BibleHub. And first one that comes up, just follow it, and that will take you right through to front page just like this one. This has just so many features, and today we just want to pick on a couple of them. First one is parallel. Something that's really helpful is to be able to put multiple translations side by side.
Particularly if you're trying to figure out, a slightly more nuanced meaning of the text and like not getting into the original language at all, being able to see how the different translators have chosen to render those words can kind of give you a more full example. And if there's, one translation that has a word that's vastly different from the rest, you can sort of start wondering why.
And sometimes if you've got 10 translations and 9 of them read pretty much the same, at least as far as meaning's concerned, and one of them deviates, you can say, I wonder if we got some translator bias there. On the other hand, if you've got 50-50, you could say, well, this might be a hard passage to translate.
And a lot of them are. There's a lot of, words that aren't used in very many places. There's a couple of words where there's actually suggestions that the author might have made the word up to sort of, compounded a couple of words to try and express what they were saying.
Well, we don't ever do that, do we?
All the time.
So, look, it's really helpful. And so all you have to do is take your mouse across and click on parallel. And you'll notice on the left-hand side, we've got New International, New Living, English Standard Version. As we scroll down, we've got the Berean Study Bible, which is actually a Bible produced by the same people who produced BibleHub. I think BibleHub's better, but that's how it goes. And then you've got New American Standard Bible, which is a literal one, the New King James, the King James. And so it goes down, and there's just heaps and heaps of Bibles, and it's a really helpful tool when you're studying to be able to compare translations. And if your desk is not quite big enough to have all those books, or your budget is not enough to have them all on your shelf, here they are all for free, and you can have it at your place. So a very useful tool. All right, so we can click on the back button, and that will take us back to where we were. And the next feature that we have found to be really, really helpful is the one that's called interlin.
Which is short for interlinear.
And this enables you to have the original language with an English equivalent and access to Bible dictionaries and word meaning and word usage.
And just some of the little, grammar details and that can sometimes help us gain some understanding on intent if there's sort of some questions on the nuance.
So why don't we go up there and click on interlin.
Just as a brief note, particularly in the Old Testament when we're working with Hebrew reads from right to left, not left to right. So we start in the beginning here.
Okay, so it's not the earth and the heavens God created in the beginning. Well,
the meaning is in this case more or less the same, but in the Hebrew it starts at this side of the page.
Okay, so that's a helpful thing to remember. And we could actually spend time with each of these words. Or we could say, well, no, we're going to move on. And if we want to move on, we simply click on the arrow there. And that takes us to the next verse. It's really quite intuitive and very useful.
And you can navigate up in the top corner there to be able to change book or chapter to make it a little easier.
Or version if you're not using the interlinear.
Yeah.
And the arrows here let you go back a verse or forward a verse. So it's got multiple ways of doing things. And suddenly we've got a whole lot of new words that we could pick on. The earth was formless and void. Wonder what void means. I wonder where else it's used in the Bible. So what we can actually do is click. And you'll notice the numbers at the top. In fact, there it is right at the top. It says that this one is the word tohu. And on the left-hand side, we have from Strong's Concordance what the word means. It tells us that it's a noun. It means formless, confusion, unreality, emptiness.
One of the things that can be really useful about using this kind of concordance as opposed to just, looking in your English Bible is not always, the words aren't always translated to the same word. So if you look up the English word, you might not necessarily get it, whereas this is going on the core original word.
Mm-hmm.
So that you'll be able to tell whether you're looking at the same core word as opposed to whatever it's been translated as, which particularly in the word we're going to look at today varies a lot. So,
and this really it's a very important feature. If you've got a literal translation, they do tend to translate the same word with the same English word. Although I did notice with the word that we're going to focus on today, that the King James had about 6 different words that are used to translate the same Hebrew word. It could just have been used the same one. The American Standard Version, New American Standard Version are much more consistent and probably better if you're wanting to study. If your Bible is a dynamic translation like the NIV, they're trying to give meaning rather than word-for-word translation. And it's a little bit harder to pick up some of these subtle nuances that are there.
Whereas this can kind of give you a list of where this is used, so you could then take the list of references from here and look in your dynamic version.
So on the right-hand side of the column there are the places where this word is used. And we notice that it's here in Genesis, that's obvious. It's down in Deuteronomy. It's in Samuel. A couple of times in Samuel, it's in Job, and so we could just keep on scrolling down. And
in the middle, it tends to give you more information about the specific details on, each different usage. This is what it tends, because some words have slightly different meanings in different contexts, so it gives you some different details in terms of the meaning of the word in this particular context, and there's more information on that in the middle section as well.
And if you're wanting to get to how is this word used in other places, then simply follow through and you'll find it's an interesting exercise to take a word and just to follow it. So that's using the Strong's numbers. Let's go back to where we were and we just click the back button and it takes us back to Genesis 1:2. And I think you can see up the top there the numbers that we clicked on just then. Underneath we actually have the anglicization of the Hebrew word, because most of us are not fluent in the Hebrew alphabet. And so when we click on that, it takes us to another list. And this time it's simply called Tohu. It tells us all the different forms it has. That's not going to help most of us.
Although it can in some ways. Like even if you think about, English, you might be looking up the word understood, but understanding, are going to be part of your search. So even if the words themselves here don't necessarily make sense, it's a slightly different form, but it's the same root. So clicking through, if this is a word you're looking at, clicking through maybe.
Okay, so we've got bitohu, hatohu, and so on. The tohu is the root. And so these are forms that just give us interesting information to help us understand.
Give us a slightly bigger and fuller picture.
And on this side, it said, look, this word occurs 10 times. And then as you scroll down, you will actually find each of those 10 times. And so we could go all the way down. But if this is something that fascinates you, you think might be interesting, here's somewhere that you can have some fun, time's unlimited. All right, so we'll click the back button. We just want to give you a little introduction to this useful tool that you can have. And on this occasion, we're going to type in a New Testament verse. And this brings us to John chapter 5, where Jesus said, "He who hears my voice and believes the one who sent me has eternal life." And different groups have gone over this one a little bit. Just what does it mean? There's a little feature here that I find really helpful. Now, many of you may say, well, look, I never studied grammar when I was in primary school and didn't get it in high school. Some of you who are older say, well, yes, but we've forgotten all that we ever knew.
While.
But look, there's Google and we can find out these things. Here's what I discovered. You can simply mouse over that and it tells you what part of speech this word is. And this is akuon. Well, this is the word to listen. From it we get acoustics and that sort of stuff. And it says that it's a present. Now, I think we know present as opposed to past or future.
And sometimes the tense of it does make a difference, you know, if this is something, if it's a future tense or if it's a present tense. Like, yeah, it's a detail that doesn't necessarily translate really well, but if we're trying to work out is something present, past, future, sometimes it's in the grammar and this kind of gives you a little hint there.
And it just helps you to check up on something, you know, is this talking about present or... And then it says it's a participle. Oh my. Yeah, most of us forgot. I had to Google it. And participles normally finishing with ing. And so in this case, it would be hearing. And if it's present, it would be is hearing. And this just adds a little bit. It's not the one who hears once, it's the one who is hearing.
It's a constant present.
It's a present continuous. And then when it comes to believing, it's the same thing. And is believing has present tense eternal life while they are hearing and believing. It suddenly just adds that little bit of clarity that it's not 40 years ago, you know, I was baptized and so I'm okay. No, I need to be hearing and believing. So just being able to look and see what part of speech it is, you may have to dust some cobwebs off.
There is sometimes useful information in, you know, and this is a masculine. It doesn't always come in handy, but sometimes just sort of matching them up. So if you're looking at a verse and you've got a masculine noun and a masculine verb, there's a good chance that those link up, even if it's not necessarily the word order we'd expect. So sometimes there is small details like that are handy as well, even if it's...
And particularly for us English speakers, because most of us have lost the idea that things are masculine and feminine. The French still have it.
Mm-hmm. There's a lot of the languages still do, it's just English doesn't.
We sort of dispense with it, except I think ships are feminine, aren't they?
There's a few things.
She's a mighty fine ship.
Cars also tend to be she's.
Yeah. Now, just because we mentioned Hebrew started that side, with Greek we do start on this side and go across that way.
The other thing with a lot of this is not to get too bogged down into it. Like, don't sort of, you know, get too worried, because this will give you a lot of information, and what you go looking for says what you'll get out of it. And
the stuff that's simple enough and the stuff there that's complicated enough, it's a useful tool.
But
and
don't get too bogged down.
Like the Bible, it may take a little while to get the grip of it. All right, so that's BibleHub, and we just find it really, really helpful when we are digging into word meanings and word usage. How is a word used? And at this point, we want to dig into a word that's actually common to many of the world religions, at least if not the word, the concept.
It comes through very strongly. This is actually the Quran.
The what?
And in all, I think it's 170 or something, there's 170 books. In all but I think one of them, they all start with "in the name of God, the compassionate, the merciful." All of them. That there are so many concepts that they have for God, but this is the most important one that, as it starts every chapter.
Every chapter starts with those words.
With those words. Except for chapter 9. I'm not sure why.
Okay, that's an interesting one. And it was interesting as you looked at the Buddhist side of things.
They've got a practice called metta. It's typically, Buddhism with meditation, but you've got this concept where the practitioner is targeting sort of themselves, loving kindness toward themselves, then loved ones, then neutral ones, then difficult people, and then, the greater world. So you've kind of got this presence of loving kindness. And again, this is a very, very ancient source.
And difficult may include rude, annoying, busy-bodied, arrogant, self-righteous, neglectful, war profiteers, fence sitters.
Some people that are typically really hard to love.
And in the Hebrew, the word is hesed, typically translated mercy.
Loving kindness is another.
Loving kindness is the one that the New American Standard Bible uses consistently. That wherever you see this word, if it's applying to God, it will be loving kindness. If it's applying to people, it's normally loving kindness, but sometimes it's simply kindness. So we've just pursued this word this week just to say, let's do a study of a word. Let's see what rabbit holes it goes down. See what we come out, what concepts lie behind this word hesed, or some pronounce it or spell it chesed.
Chesed. Chesed.
You're better at it than me.
It's actually a really, really big concept. There's there are people who, it is basically untranslatable. You can't, we're kind of just grasping, trying to understand it, but there's just so much in it. But there's a couple of characteristics that it really frequently shows up side by side with faithfulness and covenants. So that you've got quite a lot of verses where the covenant and the loving kindness are hand in hand. They're very attached. The faithfulness is also a hand in hand kind of.
We could go to Deuteronomy chapter 7 and verse 9, where God says, "Know therefore that the Lord your God, He is God, the faithful God who keeps His covenant and His loving kindness to 1,000 generations with those who love Him and keep His commandments." And that's echoed in a number of places.
And you've got this sort of underlying theme that seems to sort of weave through the narrative of Hesed, in that it's part of the covenant relationship, particularly with God and His people, but with people and other people as well.
And over, the covenant and God's loving kindness just go hand in hand.
And His faithfulness and loving kindness. We've got the Lamentations one, I think, has that one.
As we were researching this, we found that the word occurs many, many, many times. I have 25 pages here. And so if you see us shuffling papers, it says that we've been doing our research and we can't remember everything that we found. You found the one you were looking for?
No.
Let me just grab it. Daniel chapter 9. And here we're noticing verse 4, where Daniel says, I prayed to the Lord my God and confessed and said, Alas, Lord, the great and awesome God who keeps his covenant and loving kindness for all those that love him. That sounds so like Deuteronomy, doesn't it? That here you have God's covenant, but also God's loving kindness. It's a very big term.
And the one in Lamentations is actually a really well-known verse, because there's a couple of our really well-known hymns come from it, but it doesn't show up in the NIV as much. But because of the Lord's great love, we are not consumed, for his compassions never fail. They're new every morning, great is your faithfulness. You've got the faithfulness, the great faithfulness.
Great is thy faithfulness, yes. O God my Father. There is no shadow of turning with thee.
And that's coming out of, rooted in this verse, that where faithfulness and chesed are going hand in hand.
So that was one thing that we discovered as you look at how the word is used. The two of them go hand in glove.
I think this is one of the really key concepts of chesed, that we see it showing up in the relationship between God and his people clearly, because the loving kindness he shows toward his people is really, really quite often undeserved. That you've got so many times where they veer off the path, where they break the covenant, and yet he doesn't.
And maybe your greatest example of that is when they built the golden calf. And Moses comes down with the tables of the covenant. And here the people are dancing around the golden calf. And Moses goes back up to God and says, God, please forgive these people. And if you can't wipe my name, he was willing to die for his people. And he said, God, while I'm up here, can I have a look at you? Show me your face. And God said, no, you can't. That wouldn't be good for you. But then he says, but if you put your head in the rock there, I'll pass behind you. And as he goes through, he proclaims his name, the Lord, God, compassionate and gracious, slow to anger and abounding in loving kindness and truth, who keeps loving kindness for thousands, who forgives iniquity, transgression and sin, yet will by no means leave the guilty unpunished. And so he goes on. Twice, right in the middle of that passage, he uses this word loving kindness to describe himself in the context of Israel has messed up.
Again.
Not the first time.
Not the last time.
Not the last time.
I think there's quite a few examples where this comes up, and sometimes it's a little bit flipped in that, like, we've got Abraham and Lot, and this is just before the destruction of Sodom. And Lot kind of, God's get out of here, and Lot's, well, could I just go to here and not all the way there? And that's, an audacious request. It's he has no reason to deserve God doing that, but God is kind and lets that happen. And a lot of the places where you have an audacious request and God grants it, you've got chesed involved.
You've got hesed involved in the Psalms, where David has had his affair with Bathsheba. Mm-hmm. And he comes to God and says, according to your loving kindness, blot out my transgressions. And if there's something that David didn't deserve, it's what he got. That it was undeserved.
And I think, yes, this is a Hebrew word, but I think a lot of these concepts start coming really strongly through in the New Testament as well. Mm-hmm. When you start looking at some of the New Testament epistle writers particularly, some of these concepts of, the undeservingness and yet the grace.
So we're not using the word hesed because they were writing in Greek, but the concept of the loving kindness and mercy of God comes right through into the New Testament.
This one is sometimes a bit of a challenging one, in that often the person who makes the move isn't the one who you would sort of typically expect. Like you sort of, sometimes you have a do a good thing for this, I do a good thing for you, you do a good thing for me, I do a good thing for you, there's a...
And that does occur.
It does.
Like Rahab says to the spies, I'm going to let you go, but when you come and you win, then you're going to look after me. And she uses Hesed, that, I'm looking after you and you will look after. But that's probably atypical.
And the other thing is, like, there are expressions of Hesed that are, none of, particularly human, none of our expressions of Hesed are perfect expressions. It's a characteristic of God that, we kind of have silhouettes of or shadows of. But again, there's examples in the New Testament where the concept comes through, like the Good Samaritan is a good example of this. Like, the Samaritan is hated and a good Jewish person would never stop to help a Samaritan. And yet the Samaritan breaks that chain.
And Jesus said, which of these was neighbour? And his hearers said, the one who showed kindness. They had the concept of Hesed.
And it's something that even in Judaism today, it's a really key concept that's woven through how they're expected to live and function in the world. This one I find interesting, that you've got, often it's the powerful that make the move. Like, again, a New Testament concept, but where Jesus washes the feet of his disciples. Again, it's kind of a Hesed moment.
It wouldn't have worked if it had been the other way around and the disciples washing the feet of Jesus.
And so you've got this sense of power putting itself aside in kindness, that shows up in a lot of the references. I think Ruth is a great example of this particular one, but there's a sense of going way above and beyond. Like, Ruth has shown kindness to her mother-in-law. Her mother-in-law is deeply grateful, said, you've done enough. That's like, you've done more than enough. Go home and have a good life. And Ruth's like, no, that's not enough. I'm coming. And even when, she gets there, Boaz says to her, there were plenty of younger men you could have gone after, but you put the needs of your mother-in-law and doing the right thing first. And again, you've got the going above and beyond, the call to duty that comes. And that's a common theme that comes as well. And again, when you've got, this is an expression of God's character, in terms of coming to earth, that's way and above the above and beyond the call of duty.
So it's more than he could have been expected to do, but it's what he chose to be.
And there's this sort of, there's this fullness in that, that he's not giving a little bit, he's giving a lot. And, you ask for a coin, he gives you a whole bag full of coins, kind of thing. That there's, and this ties in a point we're coming to shortly, that, there's abundance there.
Yeah, in fact, it's the very next point.
And one of the verses that was a little bit more challenging is in Leviticus, and Hesed is actually used in Leviticus.
For a great wickedness.
For a great wickedness. But it actually gives us a slightly different dynamic of the word, because it can be used in a positive or a negative sense. But this idea of boundary breaking fullness, in that, if, in Psalm 23, my cup runneth over, the cup is full and it's still being poured into. And so, in the Leviticus reference, initially it kind of seems problematic, but what he's really talking about is that the wickedness is boundary breaking full. That, there are lines, and it's not just broken the boundaries, it's gone over breaking the boundaries. So you've kind of got this sense of fullness in there, even though it's a negative use of the term.
And it's the only one that we found.
Yeah. But it is there, and if you're kind of just scrolling through, it can be a little disorienting.
And there's also that sense of eagerness, that this kindness is not being dragged out like a trip to the dentist. It's willing, it's eager to be kind.
It's the first to put up its hand. It's picking the hard jobs. It's leaping full force into whatever challenging thing is in front of it.
So it's an attribute of God, but it's also an attribute that the Bible is going to say is important for us as well. And it becomes transformative that when a person has experienced, has said, that they change.
And you've got sort of also the element of, the person experiencing it, changes. It's a transformative experience. But the person giving it also changes. It's also a transformative experience. It kind of goes both ways.
In 2 Samuel, we have an interesting little verse, 2 Samuel chapter 9. And here in verse 3, David has just become king. He was very good friends with Jonathan, even though Jonathan's father Saul gave him a horrible time. Chased him up and down the country.
Tried to kill him lots.
Saul is dead, Jonathan is dead, David is now the king. And the king said, "Is there not yet anyone of the house of Saul to whom I may show the kindness of God?"
And again, you've got some of this abundant and flowing over, like his friendship and covenant was with Jonathan. Like Jonathan is gone, that is basically finished, and yet David is looking to carry it on even beyond.
What gets me is that he actually calls it the loving kindness of God. That while it's David showing it, in fact, this is David's picture of what God is like, a God of loving kindness.
And particularly if you track some of, David's Psalms, it shows up so, like there are pages of Psalm references, but it shows up so many times. And you've kind of got this picture of David who has experienced so much chesed, so much loving kindness, that it kind of makes him want to, pass on that being part of that experience isn't just experiencing it. It's, it's becoming a conduit through which loving kindness flows almost.
If you've been loved, the change is that you know what love is. And if you've never experienced love, how can you ever love someone else? And so God's loving kindness is transformative for David. And rather than being bitter, he's saying, who can I show this loving kindness of God to?
It's also, there are some sort of suggestions that there's links between this and agape love. So when you're talking in the New Testament about, this is God, this is how we know what love is. And, quite a few of this places in the New Testament where it talks about love really deeply, the agape kind of love is really quite linked to chesed idea. I think this one is one that is really important and still challenging for us, because, if you're caring about someone without needing to approve or disapprove of what they're doing, of expecting anything in return, it really changes the relationship, in that you're placing dignity on them and you're embodying, affirming their dignity, their value beyond, even if we disagree, that there is a loving kindness extended. And I think that this is one of the things that we get really strongly from God, in that we've messed up quite a lot of times, and he doesn't make us be perfect before he will extend that loving kindness.
So God's loving kindness is there before there is a response, which would be the New Testament teaching while we were still sinners, that Christ died for us.
And in that action, you're affirming the image of God in both parties, in that, the person you're dealing with, even if they're a difficult person to love, you're affirming that this person was made in the image of God, but you're also affirming the image of God in you, in that you're expressing the characteristics of God.
This is very often expressed in the worship of Israel as well, because many of the Psalms talk about his loving kindness endureth forever. And that's fitting in with the New Testament teaching too, that God is love. Love is just not what God does, it's what God is. And this expression so commonly through the Old Testament, through the Hebrew scriptures, Hesed, the loving kindness of God. It's just over and over, and it's repeated. It's there forever.
And one of the things that, like, particularly if you dig into some of the more contemporary Judaism understandings of Hesed, it's very strongly linked with an idea of tzedakah, which is, if you're giving a gift or being a service, the tzedakah is the actual gift or the service itself, whereas the Hesed is the care and the attention behind the action. So you've got these two going hand in hand. You can, give to charity or act in service and do it kind of grudgingly because you don't really want to do it, but it's the right thing to do. Whereas the Hesed is that full embodiment of, I am serving you out of joy and love rather than because I kind of have to.
But it evokes a response. In Psalm 36 and verse 7, and it is David who wrote it, "How precious is your loving kindness, O God, and the children of men take refuge in the shadow of your wings." That God's loving kindness invites people to actually come and to find their shelter in God's presence.
And like there's sort of almost a protective sense that it's not necessarily kindness that is going to avoid things, but it will protect. That it's not taking you away from the bad things, but there's that level of protection.
There's another interesting one in Psalm 40. He says, "I have not hidden your righteousness within my heart. I have spoken of your faithfulness and your salvation. I have not concealed your loving kindness and your truth from the great congregation. You, O Lord, will not withhold your compassion from me. Your loving kindness and your truth will continually preserve me." 2 verses, 2 references. And it also gives us a chance just to mention another feature of Hebrew poetry, which is what the book of Psalms really is. In English, very often in poetry, we like things to rhyme.
Rhyme and meter tend to be the English too, that, there's a regularity to the words.
Or the last word will, time and rhyme. In Hebrew, they don't do it that way. They rhyme the thought. And they will say something, and then they will say the same thing in different words, or they will say a contrasting one, and then another contrasting one, then back to the original thought. So A, B, B, A, or...
And sometimes you've got, that the thought is expanding or getting more intense as it repeats. Other times it's just kind of a how we would put like bold or italicize or underline or something. It's just, it's emphasizing the point, but by repeating it.
And it's certainly emphasizing the point here. Going from, I haven't hidden it, I have spoken. I haven't concealed it. So it's almost A, B, A for those that are into poetry and that sort of thing.
But then you've got almost the response that, you, Lord, will not hide your mercy from me. So you've got these sort of little nuanced relationships between.
And we have compassion being put alongside loving kindness. Are they being contrasted, or are they 2 different ways of saying the same thing?
And I think in some ways the answer is yes. That, Hesed is such a big concept, and just trying to get it into a small translation kind of thing one of the beautiful things that, you know, if you know and can read the original Hebrew in the way that they did, is that as you're reading, you understand all the layers that have been put into these words. We don't get it so much coming through the translation. We can kind of just go, well, this is our best guess at what this word roughly represents, but it's so much bigger.
The other interesting thing there in verse 11, your loving kindness and your truth will continually preserve me. It's almost picked up by Jesus in John's Gospel, the grace and truth.
Mm-hmm.
And we said that loving kindness was often associated with the covenant. And it's also often associated with truth.
Mm.
The number of times that we noticed that as we went through.
In some ways, particularly with that deep, strong connection to covenant, you know, this is what the covenant looks like. It's not just sort of fulfilling the legal, moral obligations of the covenant. It's an abundant expression. And in a lot of ways, Hesed is what the covenant between God and his people looks like, or is supposed to look like, depending on which direction you're looking from. But that it is deeply embodied in relationship. That even, you know, when we're engaging in Hesed with other people, what we're doing is engaging in a relationship of understanding. It's not just, I'm going to give to you because I think you need something and I have something and, you know, it'll make me feel good about myself. It's actually a relationship of understanding where I'm taking the time to see you as made in the image of God, as a person with value, and to, you know, be putting transformative energy into my relationship with you, not just kind of going, well, I've done the bare necessity, you know, I'm good for the week.
So it's about doing the right thing for the right reason and not just because it's the right thing to do.
But also doing it not just, you know, having all the right reasons and everything, but doing it because, you know, of your relationship with God. That's just what you do. It's who you are. And again, with you know, God showing Chesed to his people, it's not him deciding to. That's who he is. And I think sometimes that we put the pressure on ourselves to put it on, you know, that this is what we're supposed to look like, so I guess this is what I have to do, as opposed to this is who I am, this is what it looks like when I am who I am.
We had a whole psalm that had more references than the whole book of, well, than all the prophets put together.
Psalm 136.
Psalm 136. And if you didn't get it by the time you were halfway through, you should have by the end. Give thanks to the Lord, for he is good.
For his steadfast love endures forever.
Give thanks to the God of gods.
For his steadfast love endures forever.
Give thanks to the Lord of lords.
For his steadfast love endures forever.
To him who alone does great wonders.
For his steadfast love endures forever.
And so it goes on for 26 verses.
And at the end of every verse, that's for his love endures forever, that it is so anchored. Like all of these characteristics of God, they're anchored in that steadfast love.
When we come to the New Testament, there are other places where this concept comes across.
And particularly this one, you know, as you did it to the least of these, my brothers, you did it to me, where you've got, you know, Jesus talking about, you know, not just helping your friends, but helping the people who you wouldn't necessarily, you know, that it's kind of uncomfortable to help with, that you don't really want to be around, that you've got this, you know, it's not just helping the people that you love. It overflows beyond that. You know, if your cup is full and overflowing, the people around you are going to get spilled on, but the people, you know, it's not just the people close to you. When it's overflowing with, you know, Hesed, then it's going to spill out to everybody.
So this is inviting people to the party who can't invite you back. People who have nothing to their name, people who are hungry, people who are lonely, lacking the the basic necessities.
And again, that comes up in the parable of the bridegroom. Is it the bridegroom? I think that's what it's called.
The wedding feast.
Yeah, the wedding feast, where, he's organized this feast and the catering is all done and, he's super excited about it. And so he sends out his messengers going, the feast is here, come and, everybody who's been invited, come on in. And they're all kind of just too busy.
Make excuses.
And so he says, go out to the streets and the lanes of the city, bring in the poor and the crippled and the blind and the lame. And that's such a none of these people could afford to pay him back. None of these people are equipped to, dress themselves for this kind of event, and yet you've got him just bring everybody, bring those who can't, he has no hope of getting anything back from this. This is just, I have a party, come in.
And they do. And it sort of gives us a sense of a climate, an atmosphere.
Mm.
And Proverbs picked up Hesed in a number of the Proverbs.
Yes.
Proverbs 11 and verse 17. The merciful man, and the word translated merciful is Hesed, does himself good, but the cruel man does himself harm. We live in a world where there's a need for a lot of loving kindness, and selfishness is exactly the opposite of where the Bible is pointing us.
Even like a bit further along, by steadfast, in Proverbs 16, by steadfast love and faithfulness, iniquity is atoned for. You've almost got some foreshadowing there as well.
Well, don't be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good.
It's just so many. There's just so many.
Yeah, we're just turning pages and turning pages.
And one of the key things here, I think, is that it's not something that you can really grasp quickly, that this is something to spend time with and sit with, like we talked about last week.
And tonight we're sitting with one word. And just tracking it through and getting some of the meanings that are there just by taking the time to look it up, to think about it.
And the other thing is, by what we're doing here is not by any means exhaustive. It's just kind of almost a skim, really.
It has to be a skim.
But it's also the kind of word that the more you dig, the more beautiful it gets, I think.
But it's also a word that's picked up by the prophets. It's picked up by, well, not in word in Isaiah, but it's certainly picked up in theme. And maybe this one from Hosea chapter 6 and verse 6, where God says, I desire Hesed. I desire loving kindness.
And once you've started to get a bit of a feel for the fullness and the wealth that is in Hesed, it gives you a very different picture of God. It's not just, for I desire you to kind of, forgive them, I guess. Kind of, it's not reluctant. It's this embodiment of the character of God, really.
And it's what makes God attractive.
And you've got this concept mirrored in Isaiah 58, where he's talking about, what kind of fasting have I chosen? It's not to be following all these rules and making the sacrifices to point to something else. But what the kind of fasting I have chosen is a lot more about dealing with injustice, about looking after people, about, sharing love.
And that's maybe got some challenging practical applications in our nation as we look at how we deal with some people.
And I think, in the early Christian church, a lot of the social justice end of things was key to their practice, like the widows, the poor, the orphans, the people who were the less than and the forgotten by society, they were their priority to look after. And I think that's something that maybe as Christians we need to be having a bit of, starting to have some conversations about, in that you know, if God is desiring us to be chesed, you know, overflowing with loving kindness, what does that look like? Because we can be trying to keep all the sacrifices perfectly and not be giving God what he
really wants. And we did begin with that quote from the Quran. But for a lot of Australian Christian people, they look at Muslims through the eyes of those who are extreme. And the truth is probably that they are looking back and seeing the same lack of compassion in Christians that we think that we see.
Well, you know, the Quran is just as open to be butchered as the Bible is, really. And there are those who have butchered the Bible in similar ways. That, you know, taking the time to understand what the book is intending to say, that the character of the God in the book gives you a much better picture than the people who are misusing and abusing the text.
In Jeremiah, God wrote, "The Lord appeared to him from afar, saying, I have loved you with an everlasting love. Therefore I have drawn you with loving kindness." The thing that draws people to God
is that loving kindness.
Is the loving kindness of God. For God so loved the world.
And it is incredibly attractive. Like if you've got somebody who's just overflowing with abundance of kindness and generosity and is embodying that character, they are cool people to know.
And the early church had all things in common. There was not a person in need among them. And we've moved to a more self-centered.
And yet if you look at that, the energy in the early Christian church, the growth, the enthusiasm was, you know, the church was growing in thousands because people were looking at these people and seeing the embodiment of God and that, you know, that loving kindness, the mercy, the compassion, the enthusiastic care for others. And, you know, when you see that, it's a lot more attractive than us trying to convince others that, you know, this is the way of truth and you should get it right because you don't have it right.
And of this, the prophets would remind us.
I think this is one of the ones that I really like because you've got, this is a section and we start with a question. With what shall I come before the Lord and bow myself before God on high? Shall I come before him with? And, you know, in this context, I've turned away from it now. No, I haven't. Shall I come before him with burnt offerings, with calves a year old? Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams?
Or 10,000 rivers of oil.
Like there is, you know, an abundance here. Shall I offer my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? You know, this is offering to give up a lot. But he has told you, O man, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you but to do justice, to love kindness, chesed, and to walk humbly with your God? These are the three things. Like if you get nothing else right, these are the three things that are the things he's most passionate about us getting right.
And he has loved us with an everlasting loving kindness. And loved people will love people.
And I think like that's a beautiful picture. Like, you know, to do justice, chesed, and walk humbly with your God. Like that's just a really beautiful picture, I think.
What we've done today is simply taken one word. We've gone on a word adventure. And there's so many words like this that are waiting to be adventured, to be explored. We've given to you a tool in BibleHub, and it's not the only package, but it's one that we have found to be useful and helpful. And our invitation to you is, go on a word adventure. We'll put the notes for Hesed up on the Facebook page. You can search for it on Facebook at Working the Word, or there are links to it off the Mudgee, Oberon and Lithgow Seventh-day Adventist websites.
And if you want to dig a little bit deeper into Hesed, there's lots of resources online, but there's also a book by Michael Card called Inexpressible. And again, it's a really easy to read, really interesting, absolutely fascinating book. But where he's talking about Hesed and the mystery of God's loving kindness. And he's, kind of just devoting years because it's such a big word.
And we'll put a link to that on the page as well. In next week's program, we're going to be practicing some of the tools that we have used as we delve into the book of Genesis. So until then, we wish you God bless and happy exploring the Word this week.